couldn't have told you what venture capital was. And I sort of had this concept, I think, of startups as just like people going out and doing businesses, but no real concept of like what they did for funding. So how I got here and kind of tracing it back to when I was growing up, I'd say I was always one of those kids who had their head stuck in a book, like to the point where my parents would be like, put down the book, we need to leave for dinner. So I always loved stories. And I think the more you read, the more it kind of opens up a world of not only understanding storytelling and how to tell a story, but also understanding how to learn from other people's journeys. And so I think in part that sort of interest in stories and other people's stories and learning from those stories was a really important foundation for me, because a lot of what I do is listen to a lot of entrepreneurs all day, pitching us on why we should invest and why their startup is the right startup. And so having that sort of lens of an interest in people's stories was really important, in a lens of kind of communication. I did have sort of an interest in business from an early age. Both my parents were CPAs. My dad's been involved in a lot of startups over the years. So there was one memorable occasion in 5th grade when I emptied out all of our VHSs, which is going to date me. I emptied all our videos into a wagon and carried them around the street, offering to rent them for 50 cents overnight to all of my neighbor friends. So it wouldn't work today with streaming platforms, but I was always sort of intrigued by this concept of being able to run your own kind of thing. And that felt very cool. And so now I guess I have a little better perspective on how hard that is, but certainly the concept at least was cool to me at an early age.
Yeah, that's awesome. That kind of sounds like an early version of Netflix. So you were really ahead of your time there.
Yeah, kind of.
But I definitely see how the English and accounting are both at play there. So that's really cool. So now thinking about narrowing down on your William & Mary experience, how did your time here kind of shape both your personal and professional journey as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, William & Mary gave a really good base of learning how to learn in a way and being curious. So I always feel like I need to caveat that I did not know really what I wanted to do when I left. I mean, you could probably tell a little bit by the fact that I double majored in English and accounting, but when I started at William & Mary, I knew absolutely that I was going to be an English major. I loved it all the way through high school. I love to read, I love to write. I knew that's what I wanted to do. And so briefly, I double majored in chemistry, which I was great at the book section. And I learned I was really, really bad at the lab section, like spilling high hydrochloric molar acid on the floor, kind of bad. There may still be like dissolved linoleum in the science hall from when I was there. So I said, okay, we'll do the pivot. Let's figure out something else. And I thought, well, maybe marketing, that might pair well with English, sort of, seems like that could correlate. And then to get into the marketing classes at the business school, obviously you have to take, accounting and stats, some of those prereq classes. And I knew the one thing I did not want to do was accounting, because my parents had both done accounting, and I never considered myself a math person. Like I would never have in high school said like, oh, I'm a math person. My brother was like the math person, quote unquote. But I got into accounting and it was like, oh, like this is not like calculus kind of math. This is like math that makes sense to me because it's like how a business runs math. So it's sort of math in a weird way that tells a story, sort of like, English, going back to that kind of interest in storytelling. So for me, weirdly, I was not into math. I took no math classes at William & Mary besides the stats class I had to take, and ended up in accounting. I loved it. It was so bizarre. And in another like very small world William & Mary story, which sometimes happens, I actually had the same intro to accounting professor that my dad had when he finished William & Mary in 1966, and we had the same intro to accounting professor, which was pretty crazy. Who actually remembered my dad. He's like, you are Mooney's daughter. And I was like, yes, that's strange and a little creepy. But he was this great guy who used like chalk and got covered in chalk, and he was very old school kind of accounting professor. But it just really intrigued me, that kind of idea that you could use math to really unlock the story of what was happening in a business and understand what was going well and not going well. So yeah, I'd say for me, it was really a foundation of flexibility in learning that then frankly served me well in my first couple of jobs after school. I was down to the wire as a senior trying to figure out what I was going to do. I got sort of serious about thinking about a PhD in British Victorian literature. I did the whole like English honors thing and had an independent study with a sponsor, and got down to the line and decided, if you end up majoring just in English, you often go on to teach. And I just felt like I wanted to get out into the business world first. Not that I would never end up teaching, and famous last words, since I am teaching now, although not in English. And I wanted to figure out some exposure in the business world. And even then, I sort of fell into the career path I ended up with. I was actually debating whether to go for the Mac or to go straight to New York. I had an offer after a junior internship with PwC in their accounting department. And I got a call from their career center on a Friday afternoon, my senior year, that said, put on a suit. Deutsche Bank is on campus recruiting. And I said, I'm not a finance major. I don't know anything about investment banking. And they're like, well, they had an analyst and the analyst fell through. If you can show up in an hour, you can interview. And so this probably goes to that like flexibility of entrepreneurship, right? I mean, I've taken like 2 finance classes maybe, but I throw on a suit. It's like, it can't hurt to learn, right? And so that goes back to that like curiosity and learning base. A little intimidating, right? Because a lot of people prep for investment banking interviews for like weeks, and I was just sort of going in cold without a lot of the background. But the interview went well, and they offered me a full-time 2-year position. And then that was a tough one because I had at that point settled, you know what, I thought about the PhD. I don't think I'm going to do it. I think I'm going to stay for a 5th year master's of accounting because they changed the accounting rules. I needed some extra hours to get my CPA. But I just, this whole investment banking thing I never even thought of. And then I had a 2-year offer. They made it that Friday night, and I had to decide on Monday or else the offer would go away. It was one of those like exploding offers, they call it. So they like put all this pressure on you, and they call you over the weekend, and they try to get you to take it. And so I called them back on Monday morning, like at the deadline. And I said, look, I'm honored, truly honored to have the offer. But I feel like I'll just regret it if I don't finish out these accounting hours. It's going to be really hard to go back to school someday. And I feel like I need to get the degree done so I can get my CPA. It's been something I've been, working towards as an accounting major. And they're like, well, if you're not going to do 2 years, why don't you come up for a summer internship? So I interned within that summer. I did come back to William & Mary for the 5th year for the Master's of Accounting, and then ended up going back to the banking capital markets group at PwC. So I was up in New York City for almost 6 years, kind of hopping around in a variety of sort of big bank financial institution type roles. But the thing that really I feel like helped me stand out as a first, second year kind of associate and analyst was that broad base of interest in a lot of things. I actually had an accounting partner at PwC who was a big deal. He was in charge of the entire Barclays account for PwC. And so he was a very senior partner in the firm. And I'd only been there probably 6 months at this point. And he actually brought me a memo that he was preparing to the CEO of Barclays, kind of proposing another round of work, and said, hey, I hear you're a good writer. Could you check this for grammar? And I was like, well, that's kind of a cool thing to be able to do as a little, 6-month analyst. And it was really because of the kind of William & Mary education that they offer here, which is, try out things and be flexible in how you learn and take some classes that maybe sound scary and you never know what's going to happen. So for me, that's always been special. I've actually also stayed in touch with a couple of my professors that I just became friends with, and a couple came to my wedding, and it's been 15 years now since I graduated, but I still keep in touch with a couple of them. So I think as a student, I was sometimes intimidated by the professors. Like I never would have thought to go to like office hours and just ask for career advice. I don't know why. I think I felt like, oh, well, what would they know about it? But I don't know. It's silly in retrospect. I sort of wish more of my students came for, hey, like I'm looking for an internship. Do you know anyone at a startup you could connect me to? Because I'm happy to do that kind of stuff. And very few students like think to ask. So I try to make an offer now when I'm teaching, just to let students know like, hey, if you're interested, I'm happy to keep my radar up. But I never really thought to do that beyond the 2 professors that I just, was kind of friendly with from having taken several classes with each of them. So yeah, I think the learning environment was important, and that sort of balance, flexibility, communication, and just grit. I think at William & Mary, you have to work hard is the reality. And, that takes balance. You don't want to work so hard that you miss out on the experience of being on campus, but that kind of training to work hard and a desire to learn and knowing how to learn, I think served me really well, especially in my kind of early New York years when, the hours were long, and the ability to stand out really was from having a balanced skill set.
Yeah, that's really awesome. I'm so glad that you had such a positive, William & Mary experience. And you've hit on so many pillars so far. You talked about grit, self-direction, tolerance for ambiguity, opportunity, discovery with that, exploding offer and everything. And honestly, even some collaboration in there about your experience with your professors and everything like that. So how did you kind of leverage, that experience in the startup process or as a managing partner at NRB specifically?
Yeah, it's a very different world. The world that I came out of investing in New York and the world of startups, but there are a lot of parallels. So I'll tell you one way in which they're very different, which is the dollar size of the problems. One of my first years at PwC, I found a $1 billion error on the Barclays financial statements I was auditing. billion with a B. And my partner, looked over my work papers because I'm like, oh my gosh, I think I found $1 billion mistake. And the partner looks at it and he goes, yeah, you're right. Someone like fat fingered the Excel cell, but honestly, this is an immaterial dollar value to our audit and we're not going to raise it to be fixed. And my mind just sort of like exploded a little bit in that moment because it was like, what am I even doing here? I found $1 billion mistake and like, we agree it's a mistake and we're not going to fix it. Like, how is that even possible? Like, I'm a small cog in a very big machine. And what am I like, sort of, what is the point? I say that a little drastically. I am glad that I spent time up there and got kind of the deep dive on skill sets. But to me, venture was so much more appealing because I could see the needle moving from my own work. And I think startups are similar, right? Like you're taking on a really big problem, so that can be intimidating because the resources behind you don't start with billions, right? They're like $1,000 or a few $1,000s, and you're trying to figure out and learn and iterate. But for me, that was really exciting because I realized that I did not have a good tolerance for being in a big corporation where I felt like I couldn't make a difference. And I also realized about myself, and it's part of the reason I'm glad I started a big company, because I was learning a lot of things about what makes me really engaged in a job and what doesn't. The other thing that I struggled with in jobs is once I felt like I stopped learning, I had a hard time getting excited about going to work. And so that was just another learning about myself, right? Not everyone is that way, but a change in title or a change of money, it was like, okay, fine. But am I still learning every day? Because that's really what got me going and got me excited about showing up to my job. And in the huge firms, you learn for sure for a year or two. And then sometimes you're just so specific in a skill set that you might not be learning every day, or your days might become more predictable, right? There's always little nuances, but they're pretty predictable. In the startup world, there is no predictable day. Sometimes I almost like wistfully wish for those days when I knew what my days would be like, but I don't really. What I love about working in venture and in startups is that I feel like I make a difference every day with the companies that I work with. The flip side is there's a lot of pressure to that too, right? So as an investor in an RV, you're probably thinking, oh, we write checks, which we do. An RV writes checks and gives them to startups. But what we do that some firms, but not all, also do is get super involved with our startups. And so that always includes a board seat for us, which means that usually there's a very small board of people, maybe 3, maybe 5. And you're on speed dial for all of the challenges for that company, right? Hey, we need to go out and fundraise. How much do we fundraise? Who do we fundraise it from? Hey, we thought we were getting this awesome contract. It fell through at the last second. We're not going to make payroll. What do we do? It just can span the whole gamut. In COVID, we had some companies that were in industries that did really well and some that were in industries that really got hurt badly. We had a technology firm that did advertising for big events and media releases. And you can imagine overnight, pretty much that entirely dried up. We have another company that sources organic chicken to grocery stores. And that was the complete reverse because no one else was sourcing. The supply chain was broken. People were trying to find food at the grocery store and, Wegmans, Publix, Costco were calling our company off the hook saying, just send us whatever you have. New customers, just like everything you've got, we want it. And so being on the investor side of that is super interesting because I get sort of a hyperspeed view. I serve on anywhere from 5 to 8 boards at any given time, which means I'd say more than half of my time day to day is dedicated to solving problems for my companies. It's a really interesting place, I'd say, to be, but it can also be stressful because it is such a small bench and it's a little bit hard to like go away for vacation. We've got 4 of my companies are actually in the market right now to sell. And I just need to be there. And so, if we're on vacation or whatever, it's like, hey, there's a board call. I can't just pass it off to a colleague and say like, oh yeah, Scott will dial in. It's like, no, I need to be there and be there for the company. So it's a really interesting balance. I think for me, it's helped. I have stayed at an RV for 8 years because my key to engagement at work is continuing to learn. And there is a never ending well of learning with startups. So that's been a really big one for me, I'd say.
Awesome. So as a venture capitalist, if you were talking to a student who might be interested in either starting their own business and receiving that kind of funding, or even just pitching an idea, or who maybe even just want to go into venture capital themselves, what do you think is something that they should know that they may not learn at William & Mary?
Well, I'd say if you're thinking about starting your own business, most young entrepreneurs who come to pitch us usually have a misconception. And that misconception is that they need to present like they know everything. And so I'd say usually one of the most common mistakes is that young entrepreneurs will come pitch to us and it's like, hey, we don't have any competitors. We're a totally innovative product. We have figured it out. Here's our market path. Our team is great. Here's all the things that are fantastic about them. That makes me nervous because no startup is a fully baked cake. And I would actually rather you come to us and say, look at this cake, only a quarter baked, but here's what we know and here's what we don't. And for the things we don't know, here's why we think you as investors could help us figure that out. That actually gives me a lot more confidence in an entrepreneur because it allows me to be confident that they won't have blind spots, that there won't be ego, and that they'll be coachable. That coachability word is a really big word for us. We have sometimes said no to deals that we think could potentially be really profitable, interesting product, interesting pricing on the deal. But we've said no because the CEO we felt like wasn't coachable. And we've just found over time that values alignment is huge. And so we're looking for a management team that's values aligned with what we believe are the right values and culture in a startup. And we want a CEO who will allow advice because no human knows everything, right? And you're wasting the talents of your board and your advisors and your mentors if you're not asking them like, hey, what's coming around the corner that I can't see? And I honestly want to know, and I want to change our paths that we're better prepared for it. So I actually love it when presenters, entrepreneurs are coming to us and they say, you know what, we have some big competitors. We do. Here's why we think we can do a better job going after this piece of the market. We're not positive, but here are the trials that we've run to find out. We think we have product market fit. Here's what we've done to find it. Here's the kinds of prices we've charged. But you know what? Here's why it's not a perfect indicator of product market fit. You know, we had a small sample or we had a Williamsburg-based sample and we're going to try and launch in Richmond and that might be a little different. And then to end that with sort of an intelligent pushback to whoever your investor or your mentor or your potential board person is to say, hey, and I understand from your bio that you've got a great background in finance. We would love your help figuring out our margins because frankly, that's an area we're still trying to figure out. That to me is like a very on point conversation because we're trying to figure out the same thing. One of the most important questions we ask on the NRV side is the kind of help the company needs, the kind of help we can provide. And if it's not, we'll often refer them to someone else and say, hey, you really need industry deep specific help on health tech contacts and hospital systems so you can ramp up your sales cycle. That's not something I can help with, but I might have a colleague at another venture firm who could be a good fit. So I'd say that on the entrepreneurship side. On the venture capital side, venture is a weird industry. So most people get into it either by starting in investment banking and private equity or by starting in working in a startup. But I would say you never know until you try. And I never really had this mentality as a student, and I sort of wish that I had. I sort of was in this kind of career pathway, I guess that the Career Center at William & Mary sort of pushed, at least on the accounting students, which is like Big Four, right? Like the big companies come and they interview and you hope you get an offer and kind of that's that. And I never really thought beyond that box, beyond kind of getting that random phone call from Deutsche Bank. It was sort of like, well, you interview with the big companies on campus and that's what you do. The way we have our interns at NRV, we never post internships, but people reach out to us. They send us emails that are well thought out, sort of a, hi, I've researched NRV. I'm really excited about the focus of your portfolio companies and CPG. I'm a student at fill in the blank with a major focused on this. I really want to get into venture capital because, and then kind of that personal reason why they're passionate about it. And it's those kind of outreaches that, we don't take all of the interns because we're a small shop, but that's how we source our interns. We let people gumshoe to us because if they're willing to take the initiative to reach out, which is sort of a scary thing to do, reach out to us via email or, whatever. And it shows us that they're willing to kind of take the initiative, which for us is important because we're a small firm. And so from interns or when we do make hires, we're looking for someone who will take that initiative and be a self-starter because, we're not a huge firm that can kind of send you off to a training department. It's like, well, Laura and Scott and Ted are the training department. So, let us know as you have questions and we're happy to kind of help you along. So I'd say for, if I was going back and giving coaching to a student wanting to get into venture capital, it would be sort of that, nothing ventured, nothing gained, I guess, pun intended, to just strike out. And you never know when venture groups will be hiring. So like NRV has not made a hire for 2 or 3 years. We haven't hired someone in a long time. But venture firms tend to hire when they are fundraising for their next funds. And that often happens every couple of years. And so even if you get a no, I would still stay in touch or leave it in such a way that you think they might keep you in mind for an opportunity later. because you just never know. And sometimes we will file away kind of, oh, remember that person who came? We're looking for someone like that. I wonder if they found something, or if they've gone on to something, maybe it's 2 years later and they're ready for a new opportunity. So it can't hurt to reach out. I think especially while you're a student, you have kind of a golden ticket as a student, especially for alumni. Hey, I'm a senior at your college of William and Mary. Don't we all love the tribe? Would you be willing to just grab coffee? It's sort of that adage, like, if you want money, ask for advice. And if you want advice, ask for money. I feel a little bit the same way about career offers. You know, if you're trying to find a job, ask for advice. And if you ask for advice, maybe you're get an offer for a job kind of a thing. So I would probably start with asking for advice. You know, hey, I'm interested in the field. Would you be willing to hop on the phone with me and talk a little bit about your career experience? I'm a little more likely to take those phone calls just because we haven't been hiring in a couple of years. And so if someone's like, hey, I'm interested in getting into venture capital, could I talk to you about a position at NRV? I'll probably just respond, hey, unfortunately, we're not hiring right now, but thanks so much for your interest. As opposed to a student who reaches out saying, hey, I'd just love to learn about your background and learn about the industry. That's a little bit easier for me to say yes to. So I guess just a little bit of on the ground tactics for reaching out. And I know it's exhausting, but it's one of those fields where you just have to do a lot of hard work. Unfortunately, it's probably a million coffee meetings and you have to switch to decaf because you've had so many cups. But it does pay to kind of build that network, even though it's not a simple thing to do.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for that advice. My last question for you is kind of along the lines of advice that kind of sets it up a little bit. But so as you know, at the Miller Entrepreneurial Center, we operate on our pillars of entrepreneurial thinking. So based on your entrepreneurial journey and all that you've shared with us today, which one of our pillars do you think you want to work on leveraging more and why? And Amanda, do you mind throwing them in the chat? But I can also read them to you really quick. They are opportunity discovery, failing wisely, improvisation, collaboration, openness to risk, tolerance for ambiguity, grit, and self-direction. And Amanda put them in there if you want to look at them again. But
yeah, I mean, I will say I love the pillars from the Entrepreneurship Center because we deal with them every day in our startups, and on the venture side too, because when you think about having to invest in startups, you're having to embrace all those categories yourselves as a small firm. I think the one I probably need to leverage more is failing wisely. I am a self-admitted perfectionist, and it's not always a good thing. So my risk tolerance, because I am a perfectionist, my risk tolerance is lower, which is another one of the pillars I should probably leverage more. And startups are hard. You know, I will say there are moments where I think, you know, we're crazy to be investing in startups because we've had 10 or 11 that have really struggled and 2 that are going really well. But at the same time, I can't imagine doing anything else because I love it so much. But that sort of ability to fail, I think sometimes feels hard to me because we have investors in our fund and their criteria is very clear. You know, they are not necessarily trying to do economic development and support startups philanthropically. They're looking for an investment return. And so I always sort of have to run that balance of my investors in the fund see things in a very kind of binary way, right? You have good returns for my financials or you don't. I see things in much more like striations of color, right? Have I been helpful at a board level of these companies? Have they gotten through tough challenges? Are they, you know, are they working on all these pillars that you're talking about? And so for me, I think it's easy to get kind of putting that lens of perfection of like, hey, we have to get good returns. And this company has done that or not, kind of in that binary bucket. And so for me, I think I need to leverage more of those shades of gray. You know, someone pointed out to me that you know, you will exhaust yourself if you set a success criteria of, as an entrepreneur, getting rich, or as an investor, having really good returns. You have to open yourself up to the learnings that come along the way from failure. And I will say I've learned the most from our companies that have wound down, because you just learn a ton. And it's really hard and sad, especially as a board member, because they feel like your children. You know, you've poured hours into them and you really are, they feel like your startup in a way, because you've been working so closely with the founders. But at the same time, you know, I've learned a ton from the ones that haven't gone well. So I think that ability for me to see failure and not take failure personally has been sort of a journey that I'm still working on, to not have one of our companies wind down and say, oh, I should have done more as a board member. NRV should have done more in diligence to find out, you know, what it was. You know, we couldn't have. We did our best in diligence. We did our best in board service. The founder did their best to solve the problems. It was just something happened in the environment around the startup, or the product market fit, or the pricing and the revenue, or the cash fundraising. You know, there's a lot of things that can happen. So I think for me, it is exploring failure and allowing that failure to exist without taking it on as a personal identity, if that makes sense.
yeah, amazing. So Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think we're in a really great place to start our audience Q&A. So if you're here with us in person, I would just encourage you to kind of speak up, introduce yourself, and then ask your question. If you're online, you can go ahead and raise your hand and I can call on you, or you can throw it in the chat and I can read it out to you.
You better come up with questions, otherwise I'll start rambling about really uninteresting stories. The stakes are on.
I can kick things off. So all the ventures that you've taken on, of all the ones that you invested in, what would you say, like, you said you have a couple that fail at a time, some that do great. What would you say is like the biggest driver behind a venture, like doing well or doing not so well? Like, is there one particular trait, or is it like a mixture? Just could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think if they were all the same, I would put them into like a magic formula, and that would be how I chose startups, and we'd have a really, really successful fund. It is a little bit different every time, but I think as I've looked across the ones that have succeeded, there has been a common denominator of founder outlook, I'd say. And it sounds a little bit cheesy to go back to the pillars, but it honestly has been founders that are coachable, that have grit, that are willing to keep pivoting, that don't get discouraged, and that aren't all about themselves either. We've had some founders go by the wayside where it's like, oh, I want to be making more money, the board needs to give me a raise. And it's like, well, maybe someday, but we can't do that right now because we're fundraising and that's expensive money, and we need to be testing product market fit. And there's lots of things that need to happen first. And our really successful entrepreneurs went through, I'd say, two of our most successful companies right now are a company called Red's All Natural and a company called Shenandoah Valley Organic. Both of those companies have been around for almost 10 years. And both of those companies were on the brink of failure for the first 4 of those years, as in like barely making payroll, way behind on their vendors. I mean, the amount of grit it must have taken, and those years happened before we got invested, so I didn't have a front row seat for them, but just the amount of grit it must have taken was epic, including for like Shenandoah Valley Organic is a good example. Their founder uses family farmers to supply organic chicken. And he said he was literally at farmers' dining room tables, and the farmers in some cases had tears rolling down their face. And he was trying to explain why he couldn't pay them yet, but he promised he would pay them soon. And just having like those kinds of conversations, like the level of grit that takes to sit down, with a family farmer couple at their dining room table and say like, hey, you've given us organic chicken. I can't pay you yet, but I promise I will. I know you're having a hard time paying your own bills. Takes a lot of grit. So I think the grit and the coachability are really huge. And also every one of our companies that have been successful have had a really great team of advisors and mentors. And so the leadership team has really thrived around learning and being curious and tackling problems. So beyond that, I think honestly, there's also an element of luck. We've had 1 or 2 companies that I just think are fantastic, and something happened in the macro environment they couldn't control that didn't go their way, and they closed. And those are so, so hard. We've had a couple, and I would probably include Reds and Shenandoah Valley Organic to some extent in this category, where the macro market went the other way, right? So both of those companies provide grocery store food, and in COVID, that was a big thing. It was an opportunity they had to work really hard to take advantage of. They had to be really on top of keeping all their workers healthy and their supply chain clean, and figuring out how to get product to the right places, and then using that opportunity to turn it into a permanent opportunity, right? Like for now, there's a shortage, we're taking over this shelf, and then this is how we're going to show Costco that we are the best brand and we should keep the shelf space. So that for them was a process to sort of seeing opportunity in the market and being able to pivot quickly and take advantage of it and turn it into a longer term kind of strategic benefit was a big deal. So there's some element of sort of luck or poor luck that you can't control. Just, is the market ready for your product or not? Is the timing right or not? Are your competitors, moving exactly in your space or not? But I'd say the things that we would absolutely look for in our future companies are around that kind of those leadership elements I talked about, especially with kind of grit and coachability and desire to learn, and just all the value set that's so important.
Awesome, thank you.
Sammy, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I just want to say first, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us all. And I know you mentioned a few of the startups that you've been working with, but I was wondering what types you've worked with, like different types. And do you focus on a specific sector, or is it just sort of what comes to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I should have opened with that. NRV began as an unusual kind of fund, which is geographically focused and industry agnostic. So when we began NRV in 2011, so it's 10 years, if Professor Henshaw's in the back, we'll shake our heads together that it's already been 10 years, which is crazy. It's been 10 years. And when we originally started, we were in Virginia only, but we would look at any industry. So when I first came on to NRV, we had a wireless electric car charger. We had an electronic medical records company. We had a fintech, a financial technology software solution for private investments. We had a chia bar snack company and a few others in completely different industries. And we learned in the first few years that we in ourselves are a startup, and we had to keep pivoting our model because our original hypothesis was that by being geographically focused, we would get really good early access to things because we'd see the companies when they were really young. And then when they were ready to fundraise, we would be right there. So instead of going to San Francisco or going to New York to raise their money, they would be like, oh, NRV's been working with us for 2 years because they're right down the street. We'll use them as our investment partner. That didn't totally work, in part because a lot of the other venture groups outside of Virginia and in Virginia are very mobile, right? So they're also looking for young companies. But the other reason it was really hard is that it's really hard on a small team to be as good at understanding a wireless electric car charging as it is electronic medical records, as it is chia snack bars, right? They're just totally different industries. And I think one of our learnings is that, yes, startups have some commonalities, right? Those values we talked about are common challenges. There's some things around like governance, employees that are common challenges. When you're talking about product market fit in the wireless electric car industry is totally different metrics than product market fit at a grocery store, which is totally different metrics than product market fit for a financial software platform. And so for us, it was just a realization that was like, it's really hard to pick the winner in categories when we're all over the place with categories. So we still technically are omnibus. We will look at everything, but we have over the last 5 years really developed a focus on consumer products. So better for you food and better for the environment CPG items. That partly came out of our own personal backgrounds and interests, and partly because of an early investment we made in Health Warrior, which sold to Pepsi in 2018. And because we'd been serving on that board for 5 years, from 2013 to 2018, we just got to know a lot of players in the food and sort of better for you food space and board members. And there's a lot of sort of deal referrals that happen in the venture world. So anyway, we have evolved into more of a focus. And if and when we raise our next fund, our anticipation is that it will be industry specific. So we will only be investing in better for you foods and better for the environment consumer goods.
I've got a question for you. Can you see me or hear me?
Yeah, I can do both.
Perfect. I was wondering, in your experience with entrepreneurs, how you've seen people's backgrounds and skill sets align with the businesses that they create. And I was just wondering if you've seen any people, pivot really far from what their background is to what they end up creating successfully, or if you do see things more in line.
Yeah, I'd say we honestly don't spend much time often talking about an entrepreneur's background beyond the values that we think are important to leading the current company. And that's a little bit of a strange statement because, if you're interviewing for an investment bank, you're going to talk a lot about your finance classes and like, what's the formula for Macaulay duration and like, give me the price of a bond. Like it's very technical skills. In startups, we have found that the founder's role evolves significantly over time. And often the founder does not stay as the CEO through the end of the company's life. And I'll give you just a general example that will tie back into your question. So often we find that founders are really passionate about solving the problem that they've selected to build a company around, which makes sense, right? Like they saw a problem they were super passionate about solving. That usually turns into a passion for sales or a passion for product development. It is usually not, and it could be, but it's not always a passion for running a 50-person company and dealing with HR and employment contracts and board minutes and like lawyers and the accounting firm. And so we find there's usually a natural delineation point where the founder begins as the person who does everything and is really driving the product market fit. And then at some point, there's a maturity to the company where the person says, you know what I really love is fill in the blank. Like I love sales and marketing because I am so passionate about this brand, which is why I started in the first place. Or I really love the technology build. We have another founder who has since transitioned to the chief technology officer because he was in love with the software solution. He just was a happy clam coming up with a product roadmap for like, what are we going to tackle next as a technology? What is the next problem we're going to solve? And so it's very common that our founders end up more in kind of strategic innovation and R&D, ended up stepping out of that founder role as the end up stepping out of the CEO role as the CEO role becomes more like running of a giant corporation as opposed to like interesting needle moving problem solving kinds of things that probably appealed to the entrepreneur in the first place. We have had entrepreneurs that have had no entrepreneurship experience. We've had entrepreneurs that have come from all kinds of different backgrounds. One random example is the CEO of Reds. So he's been running a burrito company for 10 years. He did 401k sales at like Northwest Financial before that. So they're really all over. I'd say, the traditional background of like, oh, I came out of venture capital or I'm a lawyer or an accountant is actually not very common. I actually don't meet too many finance folks that are founders. Maybe we just don't have enough tolerance for risk, but I tend to see that they're usually passionate about sales, marketing, product development. But we're open to any kind of background. We're really testing for, are you passionate about the problem? And are you so passionate about solving it that you're just going to keep pivoting and pivoting and pivoting and keep solving and solving and solving for those problems? And then that becomes that coachability question too, because that's why it's so important for us to have a founder who says, you know what? I'm awful at financials. And we actually had a founder say this to us before we invested. And that's what helped us be comfortable investing, because it was like, okay, at least he knows he's awful at financials. We're going to help him find the right fractional CFO to work beside him. And because he was open to it and like met with our fractional CFO and really liked them and we plugged them in, that helped us get comfortable on a big skill set gap. So I'd say we're used to skill set gaps in our founders. We just want them to be aware of them and kind of upfront about them. And then we're happy to kind of come up with a solution for, whatever the founder's background is, to make sure they have the right skill set around them at the management level to keep doing what they need to do.
Thank you, I appreciate it. I was also wondering, you said you like to work with baby companies, or at least keep tabs on them before they're ready for investment. Like, how early do you like to meet with companies that like you see in the area, or are you still, or have you transitioned away from that and are waiting, until the next round of funding to really discover new ventures?
Yeah, I'd say at least in terms of NRV, we're in sort of an interesting place. Most venture funds have a 10-year life. There's 5 years that's called deployment, and there's 5 years that's called harvest. And so we're just at the end of our 5-year run for deployment. So we won't add many more companies to our fund, but that doesn't mean that we won't go on to raise another one and then be starting all over. So I'd say we always are happy to get to know companies. I think the challenge is just how much do you invest into them, if that makes sense. We, in the early days, would invest in very, very young companies. So some of them really, we thought were at product market fit, but weren't quite. So that early at stage, sometimes barely in revenue or almost pre-revenue. And we just found that they're a ton of work. As you guys know, right? Like really young companies are a ton of work. And so I think for us, it's always a little bit of a balance, because we want to get to know young companies, and we do honestly want to be helpful. And so Scott and I do spend quite a bit of time, like we are tonight, right? Sharing whatever wisdom we have for whatever it's worth. Scott's a mentor at SCORE. We're both very involved in Lighthouse Labs, which is an incubator and accelerator. We try to keep our pulse on what we call the ecosystem. At the same time, though, the startups are so hungry for help that if we allowed them to sort of pull us in as much as they might like to, you almost turn into like a fractional employee, which happened to me once. They gave me an email address with their company name, and it was like, we've gone too far. I'm not actually your employee. This has become like a codependent relationship. So I think it's a little bit of a balance for us, honestly, on the NRV side, just knowing how much work we have for our portfolio companies, our investors. But we do honestly want to meet young companies and kind of know what they're doing, and to be as helpful as we can in connections. And that's honestly, I have found one of the most helpful ways we can be for young companies is not necessarily helping them like figure out their margin or their product market fit, because there's lots of mentors that can do that. There are a lot of really smart people in finance and product market fit and entrepreneurship that can help. What often young companies don't have that they could use is a warm introduction from a venture capitalist to another venture capitalist. So if a company is too young for us, we like to make introductions to other seed stage funds. And the challenge there is just that venture firms like ours get inundated with opportunities. So we've looked at more than, the number I think is in the thousands. I want to say it's north of 3,000 or 4,000 of opportunities that we've looked at, and we've only invested in 2% of those opportunities, which means that we get a lot of inbound requests and we don't always get to all of them. And so the ability to refer, because if I get a referral from a venture group I trust, I'm absolutely going to read the email and read the information and want to learn more. And so that's an easy thing for NRV to do, for Scott and I to do, which is to say, hey, you know what, you're too early for us, but we have a peer seed stage investment group based in California. I think they'd be really interested. And then I'll have the entrepreneur come up with a forwardable email, please see below my pitch deck. And, here's a few bullets about exciting things. And then I'll forward it on to my colleague at the seed stage and say, hey, super cool company we saw. It's a little early for us, but it's a great one to look at if you're interested. So those kinds of things are easy to do, but also tend to be really high value for the startup, and something that we can kind of do that is just hard to get sometimes because there aren't that many VCs to be making referrals. So yeah, I'd say, we try to do a little bit of all of it to the extent we can, although we're such a small shop that there's always more I would love to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a quick question. I think you can kind of see my hand, but not the rest of me.
Yeah.
So you talked about how NRV always kind of gets involved with these companies, whether it's almost always getting on a board seat. In a version 2 of NRV, would you want to continue getting involved with every single investment? And can you talk a bit about why getting involved is really good for NRV versus other VCs don't really want to or may not have the ability to get on to get super involved, whether it's on the board level or another level?
Yeah, it's interesting because it has a lot of parallels to a startup, because the parallel I would say is when you're doing a startup, what makes you special is your white glove service. You are the founder dealing with customers and solving their problems. The challenge is like, how scalable is that as the company grows? And so I think NRV is sort of finding that same question. There are a lot of venture groups, and I'd say most venture groups tend to get really big really quickly. The way you structure fees is like as a percentage of the amount of money that you manage. And so for a team, if you're not sitting on boards, it's way more efficient money-wise to make lots of investments because you have lots of dollars under management and you're earning, 1% or 2% on a lot of dollars is way more money than 1% or 2% on a lot fewer dollars. So for us, it really went more back to the values of our roots in getting founded, which was a deep belief in what's best for the companies. And we just found that startups, when they only have a check, tend to fail more frequently than companies that take a check that comes alongside advice. And so, is this approach going to make Scott and I wealthy and go buy yachts and live on the Riviera? No. And in fact, for the first 8 years of NRV, we were running a deficit, and one of our founders was contributing capital to keep the lights on, because it really is hard to scale, right? I mean, Scott and I, and to some extent our other founders who are involved part-time, tap out pretty quickly because the board service is so involved. On the other hand, I would hate to get rid of it because I really do think, and this applies to startups too, right? Like, what's your secret sauce? What makes you special in the market? I think one of the things that makes NRV really special is our company first approach. We are absolutely dedicated to the companies that we're invested in, and it is the thing that I spend the most time on as an employee of NRV. And that's counterintuitive because the companies don't pay us for board service, right? Like, we could put in $1 million and never talk to them again, and put in $1 million and 1 million hours of work. And in theory, the financial returns could be the same, except that we believe that by virtue of being on the boards, it's not only good for the companies, it's hopefully good for our investors as well long-term. So we were chatting with someone today who runs a really large investment shop because just like you guys do market interviews, Scott and I are doing the same thing. So we were going out to different investment professionals in Richmond and saying, hey, we're thinking about raising another fund. If it looked like this, what would your reaction be? Would you be interested or not? So we're sort of testing the market, right? Doing that kind of product market fit, except that we're doing it at a fund level. And it was interesting, the conversation we had today, because he's the head of a large, very liquid kind of public type investment firm. And he said, it's interesting because on one hand, you guys are a little small to be of interest to really big institutions. On the other hand, your smallness is what makes you special, right? It's the ability of your small team to go out and really build relationships with founders. And we actually had a scenario with one of the companies that we gave a term sheet to last week. They had a competing term sheet. from another venture firm that would have provided their entire fundraising round. So they're looking to raise $5 million. They had a lead sheet for $5 million, right? So sign it, done, you're done fundraising. But they had gotten to know Scott and I over the last 4 or 5 months. We've been down and just sort of shared about NRV's values and what we believe in and how we work on boards. And so they actually came to us when they got the term sheet and said, hey, look, we got this term sheet. We know you're at the end of the fund and you couldn't cut a big check, but we would honestly rather work with you. Would you be willing to do a term sheet, even if it's a much smaller dollar amount? And then we'll just commit to best efforts working with you guys to figure out where we'll get the rest of the money from. We might raise it from individuals. We might try to find other small funds. And so that's what we did. And so I think in some ways that's a really interesting indicator of our product market fit, that we have something special in the way we work with companies, and that does mean something, that our potential companies reach out to the CEOs of whose boards we serve on. And it's not like, oh, you can just talk to this one person and then don't call the other 10 because it went really badly. It's like, no, call any company that I've ever served on the board on. They'd be happy to be a referral. And so I think that's something really strong about NRV. But on the other hand, I still sometimes struggle with the fit as we scale and what does that mean? But then again, who says we have to be a really big, super profitable venture capital firm, right? We're values driven, and that's what makes us special. And if that means that we stay a little smaller with a little smaller team and hustle, maybe that's just what we choose to do. So I think it interestingly has a lot of parallels to startups figuring out their own product market fit, but it's something we've sort of gone a little bit back and forth on.
Thank you.
I actually have another question. I guess traditionally, venture capital firms aren't necessarily saturated with women. I mean, I'm obviously not in venture capital here, so I could be wrong if that's changed in the last
You're not wrong, no.
Wanted to know kind of what your experience has been like as a woman in venture capital.
Yes, so 96% of the top 100 venture firms in the US, this was a Crunchbase study that happened in 2017. So the data is a few years stale, but we haven't refreshed it, and I don't think it's changed much. Of the top 100 venture firms in the US, 96 did not have a single woman on their investment committee. So it's not like 96 were not majority female, 96 did not have a single female at all on the decision-making level of the firm. So yes, it's definitely sort of a world in which more diversity and inclusion is needed desperately. One of my colleagues and I at NRV, when we were fundraising for our current fund, looked around the room and realized that we just did not have many women considering an investment either. We went out to almost 400 people pitching our investment in our fund. We ended up with 83 of them. So that also tells you just how much work it is to fundraise in a venture fund. And we started asking ourselves, like, why is that? Is that a education that women just aren't as involved, and so they're not in the network to hear about it? Is it access? And the same goes for diversity on not only gender, but racial as well, right? How do we improve the diversity and the inclusion in the field? So we started a lunch, just sort of a what is venture? How does it work? Educational lunch. And we thought like 10 people would come, and we had 75. And it was like, maybe there's demand for more of these types of conversations. So we had another event, and then right before COVID, we had a regional event at William & Mary, which we had to cap at the fire code at over 200. So we've now got more than 1,000 women on our distributions that come for educational kind of seminars throughout the year. We're still trying to figure out what we want to be when we grow up, honestly, because Liz and I didn't intend to start a women in venture group. It's just sort of a conversation that just had so much demand that we kept it going. But yes, when we originally started Women in Venture, so I'd say as of 2 years ago, I have been the only woman in the boardroom at every single board meeting I've ever attended. And that's not just board members, that's management too. So that tells you it's not only a question at the board level, the venture capital level, it's also a question at kind of startup leadership level too. We've since added a couple of female founders, which is exciting. I don't happen to sit on their board, so unfortunately my statistic is still true. And actually at Farmer Focus, Shenandoah Valley Organic, we had 21 people in the room for the board meeting, and I was the only woman. And we had one Black investor there, and we were sort of it for quote unquote diversity. So it is an interesting field. On one hand, you hear the stats and it's like, well, that's terrible. What's wrong with venture capital? On the other hand, it's really a pipeline problem. To my perception. If you look at the investment banks, which is where a lot of venture capitalists come from, the splits are not too dissimilar. When I was at Deutsche Bank, and it's roughly the same statistics, the managing director kind of decision-making level was 90% male. So tended to be that the analyst and associate class was 50-50, but there was a lot more attrition of women kind of along the way as they rose up the ladder. And so if you lose people in those pipeline areas, like investment banking, like private equity, you're probably going to have a tough time getting diverse, inclusive demographics in the venture world. So it's something we do actively try to keep an eye on at NRV, particularly for our interns, because part of it is just getting your foot in the door, right? It's an opportunity to get your foot in the door, especially if you're not coming from a traditional job like investment banking or something else. So yeah, it's definitely a split. I'd say I'll just tell you one more story, which is where I really noticed it. I was at an investor conference, and they had like a big meet and greet. This was obviously pre-COVID. So there were close to 100 people in the room. And it was one of those things where you could like sign up ahead of time. And so you had people's names all in a row, but you hadn't necessarily met them before. It was sort of like an investor mixer kind of speed dating sort of thing. But you're talking about like, oh, what does your fund do? What does your startup do? And you're trying to figure out, are there connections I can help you with? Or is this an interesting investment? So I had 10 or 15 people I was meeting with, and I had all these descriptions kind of written in shorthand. They'd given me, like red shirt, blue blazer, bald with glasses. And I realized that I didn't have to give my description to anyone because I was the only woman in the room. And so it was like, you'll find me, I'm the only woman in the room. And so that was kind of a weird moment when it was like, oh, I have to get descriptions from all these people, and there are 100 people in the room, and I'm very easy to find. So yeah, it is an interesting thing. But on the other hand, I love the people I work with. And so it's not something that's necessarily something I think about every day. But I do think about it a lot in terms of pipeline. So, how do we get people, and this works in startups too, right? How do you think about diverse and inclusive teams at a startup level, at a senior management level? Because the founders, the chief marketing officers, the CFOs, the CEOs at startups will probably then go on to mentor other startups, will probably then go on to someday join startup boards, right? And that's all like changing the cycle for the future.
Awesome, thank you.
I have a short question for you. You're teaching entrepreneurial ventures or financing entrepreneurial ventures right now, and it's at a weird time for me, but I've heard so many people raving about it, and you've just had 2 classes. So I'm wondering, are you going to teach it again? Do you know? And if not, where do I go to learn all the things that I would otherwise be told by you?
I did not plant that question, Laura.
Graham. Yes, that's an excellent question. So in addition to working at NRV full-time, I also have 2 elementary schoolers and a puppy. So my kids are 6 and 8. My husband works full-time actually at a startup doing technology, and just went back to Darden to do his executive MBA. So we've got a lot of things juggling at the moment. So I'm teaching an undergrad section. I think this spring I would normally teach an MBA, but we're going to find someone else to do the MBA course. And then next year for the fall undergrad, we'll see. So stay tuned. But I think if it's either not taught by me or not offered, well, I know it'll be offered because it's part of the curriculum. So stay tuned on next fall. But I'm also happy to share the materials, and the potential other person we had thinking about teaching, Mike Page, is fantastic too. He and I have worked together on a lot of things. So I'd say in the meantime, it's not a class we can offer all the time because it's sort of a niche one. But in the meantime, if you are a venture that comes up against some of the problems we talk about, which are like, how do you figure out how much money to raise? How do you turn that into a term sheet? Should you raise a convertible note or a price stock? How do you think about setting your board? What are some things you should be thinking about growing your company so that it's exitable? What are some reasons not to take venture capital, right? We talk about that too, because venture capital comes with strings. So I will say, Graham is great about making connections. Professor Henshaw is great about making connections. And if you guys are in a venture and like stuck on one of those topics, just ask him to connect with me. I'm happy to sort of opine. We've had a handful of student ventures come through the Miller Center that some took my class and some didn't. And I've always been happy to hop on the phone with them. And it's always super interesting what the questions are. There was like a cryptocurrency one, and just the types of challenges they have are super interesting. And I'm always happy to help if I can.
Thank you.
Great. It looks like we're coming to the end of our time, sadly, but Professor Markley, I want to thank you so much again for dedicating your time to us today. And I wanted to thank everyone who was able to come here in person, even though it's a rainy day. Thank you all for being here, and everyone for joining online as